Let's dive into one of the absolutely strangest, most tragic, and, well, frankly, unbelievable events in all of military history. This is the story of how a massive army managed to completely and utterly defeat itself without a single enemy soldier anywhere in sight.
I want you to picture this. It's a pitch-black night, September 1788. The air is heavy, it's foggy, and it is tense. All of a sudden, these panicked shouts just rip through the darkness. "Turtsy! Turtsy!" which means the Turks, the Turks! And in an instant, chaos. But here's the thing, the enemy isn't there.
And that really is the central mystery here, isn't it? It's a puzzle made of panic, confusion, and just catastrophic mistakes. How on earth does a huge professional army tear itself to shreds when there's no one even there to fight? Well, let's get into it.
What went down that night was just a horrifying storm of friendly fire. The Habsburg army, we're talking about a major European power here, basically dissolved into a terrified mob. They were firing at shadows, at sounds, and ultimately, they were firing at each other.
But to really understand how something this crazy could happen, we've got to rewind a little. This disaster wasn't just some freak accident. The army was, for all intents and purposes, a powder keg, just filled with problems, waiting for a single spark to set the whole thing off. So here's the setup for this perfect storm. You have this Habsburg army made up of a whole mosaic of different peoples: Germans, Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, Romanians, you name it. They're exhausted, they're stressed from the campaign, and, this is the critical part, a lot of them literally could not understand each other's languages. Now you add pitch-black darkness and the constant pressure of war, and yeah, you've got a disaster in the making.
And what's so wild about this whole thing is what actually lit the fuse. This massive military catastrophe wasn't started by some grand tactical blunder. Nope, it was ignited by something incredibly small and incredibly human, an argument over some booze. So here's the play-by-play. A unit of cavalry scouts, hussars, they're scouting the area and they come across some locals selling schnapps. So, naturally, they decide it's time for a little party. A bit later, a unit of infantry shows up. They see the party, they want in on the drinks, but the hussars say no. Well, one thing leads to another, and this argument quickly turns into a full-on drunken brawl.
And right there, in the middle of this petty, drunken fight, a single gunshot rings out. That one shot, that is the spark that plunges a 100,000-man army into a complete vortex of self-destruction. And you can just watch the dominoes fall from here.
It is a perfect chain reaction of panic. The shot is fired. Some soldiers, totally panicked, start yelling, "Turkish!" Other units hear the gunshot, they hear these shouts in a language they don't recognize, and they assume the worst, it's a Turkish ambush. So the officers try to get control, screaming commands, but that just throws gasoline on the fire.
And this right here, this is the fatal moment of miscommunication. You've got German-speaking officers screaming, "Halt! Halt!" which, just means stop, stop. But if you're a terrified Romanian or Slavic soldier in the dark and you don't speak German, it just sounds like a foreign battle cry. Some people think it sounded like the Turkish cry, Allah, Allah. In the middle of all that panic, they mistake an order to stop fighting for a reason to start shooting.
The breakdown of command was just absolute. The Habsburg emperor himself, Joseph II, he actually rides into the chaos to try and stop it. But in the darkness, his own men mistake him and his staff for Ottoman cavalry, and they open fire on him. The emperor is nearly knocked right off his horse and has to literally flee for his life from his own troops.
So as the sun started to come up, the horrifying reality of what happened became clear. The fighting didn't stop because order was restored. It just stopped because the army had basically exhausted itself. The scene was just one of total devastation.
The cost of this single night of madness was just staggering. Now, exact numbers are debated, but some of the more conservative estimates put the casualties at around 2,000 soldiers killed or wounded. All of this without the enemy firing a single shot. The army did the Ottomans' work for them.
And the strategic result? Well, get this. 2 days later, the actual Ottoman army arrives. They're expecting a massive battle. But instead, they just find a demoralized, shattered Habsburg army that's already retreating. They simply walked right in and took the town of Karánsebes without a fight.
So you might be wondering, why does this bizarre story from over 200 years ago still matter? Because the epic failures at Karánsebes teach us these timeless lessons about warfare, about communication, and about the psychology of fear that are still incredibly relevant today.
In fact, you can draw a straight line from what went wrong that night to how modern armies operate.
The total communication breakdown, that's why there's such a huge emphasis today on universal operating procedures in coalition forces. The inability to tell friend from foe, that directly led to technologies like IFF, Identify Friend or Foe systems, and night vision. And the total psychological collapse, well, that's why there's so much focus on resilience training to help soldiers handle the immense stress of combat.
You know, there's this classic military term, the fog of war. It's meant to describe that feeling of total uncertainty and confusion on the battlefield. Well, Karánsebes might just be the most extreme, most literal example of it in history. The fog wasn't just metaphorical. It was a real, physical darkness filled with panic, where an entire army became its own worst enemy.
And that really leaves us with a final, pretty sobering thought. The story of Karánsebes forces us to ask this really fundamental question about conflict. It's this powerful, cautionary tale that proves that sometimes the most dangerous threats to any large organization, whether it's an army or even a company, don't come from the outside. They come from confusion, mistrust, and breakdown from within.